one of the other reasons I decided to come was because 3 really important people in my life are here, and I thought these 3 people are going to be the one place, the one time I've got to be here. And one of them, of course, is Tim Noakes. Tim and I have known each other for 30-odd years. We were both teenagers when we met, but we come from the same background in that we're both sports medicine, sports science, and we've both sort of moved, I guess, our careers into this area. And 6 years ago, I was living in England, and I was fat and sick, and I was overweight, and I was unwell. I was pre-diabetic. I had a fatty liver, and I heard about Tim's transformation, and as was pointed out yesterday, Tim's challenged a lot of ideas over the years, and he's always been proven right. But I really thought he'd just lost his marbles this time. I thought, he's finally, he's gone. He's been on the verge for a long time, but Noakes has finally lost it. And I thought, this couldn't possibly be right. This business that carbs are wrong and fat's right. And so I guess it made me at least think, and it made me review things. And so the first thing I did after that was to get a book, and I got Good Calories, Bad Calories, and I read that book, and that book changed my life. And it's an amazing book, and I'd never met Gary until this week, so I was very privileged to meet him, and it changed my life because not only did it explain why the differences between fats and carbs, but it explained sort of how it all happened. The politics of how the low fat movement won out over the low carb movement, and which for reasons that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with money and politics and your Department of Agriculture. And then I was fortunate enough, I read that book, and I remember it was really disturbing. I'd put it down every night, and I'd sort of shake my head and say, "No, this couldn't be right. We couldn't have been wrong for 30 or 40 years. It just couldn't be right." And I really found it very, very disturbing. But my therapist and I worked through it, and so I'm okay. And then of course Nina, whose book is just the most amazing book. I thought Good Calories, Bad Calories was good, but I can say this. I think Gary's left now. I thought Big Fat Surprise was even better. And people ask me. People often say, "Oh, what's the best book you've ever read?" And I say, "Oh, Big Fat Surprise." You're supposed to say, I don't know what you're supposed to say, but something sort of a historical or a novel or something. And it's the most amazing book. And I buy that book by the dozen, and in fact, any doctor I come across in Australia starts talking about diet, I ask them, "Would you read a book?" And you've got to say yes, because you can't say you wouldn't read a book. So they all say, "Oh yes, yeah," and even though they probably haven't read a book for 10 years, and so I say, okay, I hand them that book, and I give them a copy of Big Fat Surprise, and they say, "Oh, we'll give it back to you." I said, "No, don't give it back to me. Give it back. Give it on to another doctor." So that's been my little way of doing it. But I should say that there's an even better book out now, but I'd be too modest to talk about that. So, look, I first met Steve, as he mentioned, a few years ago when we were both in Liverpool. Steve was with Everton, and as he mentioned, Liverpool is a divided city. Tim knows this. He was born in Liverpool, and he was born on the right side of Liverpool, and it's an incredibly passionate soccer town, or football town as they call it. And you're born red or blue, and that's it. You don't change. And they're both great clubs. There's one significant difference between the two clubs in that one wins trophies and one doesn't. But Steve's probably never seen these trophies before, but that's the... anyway, we won't go to that, sometimes you can be unlucky in life. But Anyway, let's move on. We live in the carb generation, and we've all grown up in athletics with carbs. And to be honest, I had an initial interest in sports nutrition many years ago. I co-authored the first Australian book on sports nutrition called Food for Sport. But to be fair, then it got pretty boring. It was just carbs, pasta parties, carb loading before marathons. Gatorade, Powerade, that was it. So I really wasn't. I'd lost a fair bit of interest, and really it's just been rekindled over the last few years. So what's the best fuel? Fats or carbs? And we've heard that as far as endurance athletes go, I happen to have the same photo that Tim used from that classic Ironman. But clearly that in the endurance and ultra endurance events, I think it's pretty clear now that fats are a very good fuel for endurance events. Similarly, with strength sports, there's not a lot of research out there, but there's a paper in Gymnasts and so on that it shows that you can certainly maintain strength on a low carb, high fat diet. You may not gain so much, but what you do is that you lose fat, and so you improve your power to weight ratio. So as far as endurance and strength goes, probably a low-carb diet is pretty good. I guess the interesting thing is, what about the sort of these high-intensity intermittent team sports, so the various football codes and basketball and hockey and so on? What's the story there? We've got a lot of anecdotal evidence. I know you can't talk about this guy anymore in this state, but anyway, he used to be quite good, I think. But he won't be any good anymore. He's gone to this anyway. Well, we won't go into that, but. There's plenty of anecdotal stuff that people talking about going on low carb, high fat diets in Australia. This Gary Ablett guy is sort of one of the superstars of our football down there, and the All Blacks have been well known to be involved in that. And America's most famous team, Team Kardashian, has also got taken up the keto diet, and they seem to be doing pretty well, money-wise anyway. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but what's the science? What is there much science in this sort of team sport thing? Well, going way back into the 90s, there's a couple of papers on soccer where they compared low carb and high carb diets, and Banksbo, a very well known researcher, showed an improvement in total distance with a higher carb diet than compared to a lower one, which is not surprising. And another one similarly in 1999. Looked at a high carbohydrate diet and showed they were able to do more high intensity exercise. So really the only the most sort of interesting paper really is this paper from 2013 from a Greek group, and they compared high and low carbohydrate diets on distances covered in soccer. And Steve's just been talking about the importance of distance in soccer. And what they set out to do was to compare two isocaloric diets of quite different carbohydrate content, 8 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram compared to 3 gram, in an attempt to examine whether those dietary interventions had an influence on distances covered. And they weren't classic sort of low carb, high fat, but it wasn't bad, really. I don't think they were trying to sort of make it that way. But if you look at compare the diets, you can see the nutrient content of the two diets there. Roughly speaking, the high carb diet was about 75% carbs, and the low carb diet's about 30. I mean, not super low, but certainly lower than a lot of the other papers that you read. Interestingly, the important point to make is that they only had 3.5 days of this diet before they played their game. So pretty short period of time leading into that. And you can see there the black lines are the high carb diet, and the white are the low carb. So clearly, just about every player ran further on a high carb diet than a low carb diet. And so they concluded that the high carb diet enabled players to cover a greater distance compared to the low carb diet. So that's really about all there is in the literature on team sports and comparing diets. Now we know, as I'm pinching one of Steve and Jeff's Verta slides here, that 3.5 days is pretty meaningless. Really, it's not long enough to really make a difference. And Steve pointed out in this really good blog, even though we think that 2 or 3 weeks might be enough because you can get into a state of ketosis, it probably actually takes months to become fully keto adapted, which was something that I, like many things, Steve and Jeff have enlightened me on. Now, there are a number of different teams, sporting teams around the world, whether that be in Australian football or in the NBA, the English Premier League, in World Rugby, who at some stage have sort of dabbled with or are continuing in some cases to go with a low-carb, high-fat diet. And it's very easy to say, they won the championship or they didn't win the championship, therefore that proves that diet works. And we know that's not science, but we're always happy to jump on that bandwagon when it happens. A lot of people now in the sports nutrition world are talking about this concept of periodized nutrition. And periodized nutrition was defined as the planned, purposeful and strategic use of specific nutritional interventions to enhance the adaptations targeted by individual exercise sessions or periodic training plans, or to obtain other effects that will enhance performance longer term. What that means in English is that they're really that you're adjusting your fuel depending on the demands expected of your body. So on what they're saying is that on a high training load day, then you would increase the amount of fuel, in particular carbohydrates, and then on low training days or rest days, you would reduce the amount of carbohydrates. And that's been referred to as the train low, compete high concept. Originally, we talked about that as far as altitude goes, but it's sort of swapped over to carbs these days. And there's our friend Louise Burke up there again, who's backpedaling at 100 miles an hour, and she's now talking about training high and training low. And say for someone like a Tour de France cyclist, Chris Froome, who has been very successful, not this year but other years, has been a big proponent, his James Morton, his nutritionist who I work with at Liverpool, does exactly this. So on big training days or on big race days, he loads up with a lot of carbs, and on quieter days or on rest days, they actually go with a sort of a low-carb, healthier fat diet. So that's become quite a popular sort of a concept in sport at the moment. So the issue is, as we always say, there is no one diet for everyone, and that's certainly true for in sport, and it's probably true even within a particular team. I think there are some general concepts that we would all agree with that that footballers or basketballers should adhere to, and that's generally a low-carb, ketogenic diet, avoiding sugar, processed foods, vegetable oils, etc. But it doesn't suit everyone. And I think there are sort of 3 scenarios really, and in the teams that I'm in, we sort of divide the players sort of divide themselves up in the end into 3 different categories. Now, there are certainly some athletes in team sports with high-intensity intermittent activities who manage perfectly well being full-time, low-carb, ketogenic diet. They don't need any extra supplementation, they have plenty of energy, and they have all the advantages of which we're well aware of a ketogenic type diet. But not everyone. There are other athletes who will tell you that by and large, I feel really good on this diet, but I just feel when I need that extra burst of energy, or when I need to sprint, or I just don't have that other gear. And these people probably do need to top up on some carbs, maybe on their major training day or on their match day. And those carbs may be in the form of a resistant starch, for instance, like the UCAN, or the more traditional sports drinks or gels. So that's a second group who are, by and large, low carb, become ketogenic, but just need that little top up in intense activity. I see quite a few cyclists, and some of them will tell you that, I feel great most of the time, but when I have to sprint or when I have to climb, I just feel I just need that extra little bit of energy. So that's that sort of second group, if you like. And then there's a third group who need a sort of constant low level of carbs, who struggle when you get down to that 30, 50 grams of carbs that we talk about in a ketogenic diet. And they seem to do best on a say 50, 80, 100 gram diet. I don't think anyone needs to be on more than that, even if you're an athlete. I mean, traditionally athletes have had massive 800, 1,000 grams of carbs if they're just relying on carbs. But if they're fat adapted, as they should be, they can manage very well, maximum on 50 to 100 grams of carbs. And then, of course, there's all the additional advantages that have been discussed of being on a low-carb ketogenic diet if you're a sports person. One is weight loss. I mean, it's amazing how many high-level athletes are overweight. Not obese overweight, but just 2 or 3 kilograms overweight. Despite doing huge amounts of training, they're still overweight. You put them on a low-carb ketogenic diet and they drop 2 or 3 kilograms. Quite incredible. And they'll all tell you they feel much better for it. And that, of course, they don't lose lean body mass, so they improve their power-to-weight ratio. So that's one advantage. Obviously, there's advantages in metabolic health. And I have a real concern that, in cases similar to Tim's, really, I mean, we've had a whole generation of endurance athletes, semi-serious, serious endurance athletes, who for 10, 15, 20 years have had massive amounts of carbohydrates, largely in the form of simple carbohydrates like sports drinks and so on. What's going to happen to them? That really is a concern. Anecdotally, we're hearing lots of reports of cardiovascular heart problems, in particular in retired elite triathletes and Ironman triathletes, and everyone sort of says, "Oh, it's the strain on their heart. They've pushed themselves so much." I suspect it's not the strain on their heart. I suspect it's the insulin resistance they've developed over those years of such a high carbohydrate intake, and it's time to stop that. Okay, there is no need. We know now that you don't have to have a high carbohydrate diet to be an elite athlete. And I think it's almost negligent now if we're recommending a high carb diet to our athletes. Recovery is the biggest issue. I mean, it's probably the single biggest issue in team sports. Now, by recovery, what we mean is how quickly you recover and how efficiently you recover after your game. So Steve's Columbus Crew play on a Saturday, and the coach wants them to be able to train well during the week. And so if they're still sore on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and they can't really get moving until about Thursday, then that's no good. Or in the English Premier League, they play 2 games a week. In the NBA, 3-4 games a week. Recovery is just so important that you've got to be able to get back to where you were within 24 hours. And we know that a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic type diet dramatically improves recovery after intense activity. So that's a really big factor, I think, in why we should be heading down this track. Along the same lines as inflammation. I mean, chronic inflammation, chronic injury. Every elite athlete carries an injury. There's no footballer or basketballer or hockey player who ever goes onto the field, no professional who ever goes onto the field 100% fit. They're always carrying some low-grade inflammatory tendinopathy or whatever. And again, we've shown very clearly that a low-carb, high-fat diet reduces inflammation. And so you'll have a better response to injury with this diet. And then, of course, there's the reduced need to refuel during activity, which is not so much of an issue in the shorter sort of team sports. But some of these team sports go, like your American football games, go on for about 8 hours and play for 10 minutes. But You've got to fit those ads in. It does require some refueling. So what we know, if I could summarise, we know that low-carb ketogenic diets will increase fat oxidation. Anecdotally, we know, and there's a fair amount of research as well now, that endurance athletes perform better on low-carb ketogenic diets. High-intensity activities may be compromised a little bit by the diet, but the research evidence is still not clear, and there's really very little research done on these high-intensity activities. So what we don't know is how long does it take to fully adapt, and we don't really know much about these high-intensity intermittent sports from a scientific point of view. So what I suspect is that there is considerable individual variation. We have responders and non-responders to the low-carb diet. I believe that a low-carb diet is generally better for certainly ultra-endurance, moderate intensity, recreational exercise, 65, 70% of your VO2 max. You don't need carbs for that. You can do all that using fat as your major fuel. Some high-intensity athletes may need additional carbs. Not all of them, but certainly some of them. And this whole concept of training low, competing high is quite an interesting one, and I think we'll hear a lot more about that. So what do I tell my athletes? I tell them that their basic diet should be a low-carb, healthy fat, real food diet, avoiding sugar, processed foods, and seed oils. I tell them if they're going to change their diet, they shouldn't do it the week before their premiership match. You need time. The off season is the time if they're going to change their way of eating to a low carb eating from the current high carb eating. Do it in the off season. Give yourself time to adapt and get used to it. You may find that you need to top up with some carbs before or during higher intensity activity, but everyone is different, and you've got to find out what works for you. Thank you very much.